We're going to continue with what I hope to be a series of short 15 minutes or hopefully less sometimes commentaries on the Gospel of Mark. And we've had two prior sessions. The first was an overview of the Gospel, uh, the whole Gospel in a sense. And the second one was on the nature of biblical composition, how the Bible is really a work of art, uh, and that these writings are artistic compositions with a literary style and contents for a theological message. And I didn't want to prolong the introductory, somewhat theoretical uh, discussion of Mark. I did speak in terms of the Gospel of Mark and many other biblical writings as showing us, first of all, the tip of the iceberg, and that then we scuba dive as deep as we can and see the whole infrastructure or sustaining part of the tip of the iceberg, which is incredibly huge. And I was thinking of, somebody with a mask and a scuba tank looking at part of the ice under the water, and it's just a little. It's like the elephant, and the blind man saying the elephant has a trunk, or he's got the ivory fangs, tusks, and then in the legs, the trunks of trees, etc. So huge that you could, look at it from many different angles. And I anticipate that our discussion of Mark will really take us through almost the whole Bible. We're going to begin with the very first verses of Mark, and we'll get a taste right now of what I call hyperlinks, a little citation from Isaiah or Malachi or whoever, and it really it would be like clicking on it and then having a whole open series of links or passages that in a way really refer to the whole biblical story as rich as it is. And so I think we have a lot of cloth to cut from. uh, I did my doctoral dissertation on 3 verses of Mark, the so-called temple cleansing. It was published by Edwin Mellon Press. But if you looked at the index, besides rabbinic and Dead Sea Scrolls and all kinds of other stuff, the Old Testament is quoted in almost every book. So for 3 verses of Mark, I brought in quotations from almost every book of the Old Testament, especially Leviticus, for example. You may not immediately think that Leviticus has much to do with Mark, but everything regarding the leper and the bleeding woman and some other things have to do with the Gospel of Mark. So, without further ado, as we say, uh, I want to discuss the very beginning of the Gospel. And this will give us a taste of this approach that I am proposing, so that we can see how this gospel, apparently very simple, is actually incredibly profound, and that's a sign of its inspired nature. And the interesting thing, again, for Mark is that since it is probably the first gospel of the 4 to be written and used by Matthew and Luke, it'd be interesting to know what the original basis is about. And then at some other point, we could discuss Matthew or Luke and see how much of Mark they use or understand, and how much is really just a framework for their own approach and story, and addressed to their own communities and concerns, etc. But nothing like the proof being in the pudding. So we'll begin with the Gospel of Mark. I think you can see the screen there. The beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And we already said that this is like a bookend to the centurion's confession in chapter 15, I think verse 39. We spoke about the fact that only when Jesus dies and in the way he dies can a human being know that he's the Son of God. And that's the main topic, I think, but it's a huge topic because when we get into the idea of Son of God, you also get into the Son of Man. There's a great Jewish rabbinic scholar at Berkeley, Daniel Boyarin, sort of a dissident Jew, and he wrote a tremendous book, The Jewish Gospels, and it's a short book but packed. He studied all this stuff about Enoch and the Son of Man and Daniel and all this other stuff, and he thinks really the expression Son of Man is much more blasphemous, if you will, than Son of God or Messiah. We said that Son of God can mean Israel, the firstborn of God in Exodus 4, or the sons of God, the angels, and then the righteous sufferer. I'm repeating myself, but I will repeat myself quite a bit. And the Messiah, the adopted Son of God. But the Son of Man, who gets all power and sits at the right hand of the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7, and then who in the book of Enoch, the first book of Enoch, has a big role. According to Boyarin, that was really what got Jesus into trouble. And he said that among Jews in the time of Jesus, there were tremendous debates and bitter quarrels. But he has this wonderful line, as I remember, but to be crucified for something, that must have been a doozy debate. So without getting into Boyarin so much, I read it a while back, and I'm not using it right now directly. I know that the idea of a new Adam, a son of Adam, that's what Son of Man means. Bar Enosh in Aramaic, in Daniel 7, which is in Aramaic, Jesus' language. Or Ben Adam, Son of Man, which is an expression used in the Old Testament. Ezekiel uses it. Luke's genealogy is from Joseph up to Jesus, son of Adam, son of God. That's how he does his reverse genealogy. Matthew has it from Abraham to David to the exile to Jesus. But Luke has it the opposite, and son of Adam is really the next to last title of Jesus, or descent of Jesus. So that Daniel 7 will be incredibly important. It's a recapitulation of the history in the Bible where nations, pagan, oppressive empires have oppressed Israel and have had this power or authority, potestas in Latin. In the translations, they say authority. I know that they're using dominion, which is a very good translation in Daniel, but then they switched to authority for the same concept and word in Mark. He spoke with authority, not like the scribes and Pharisees, etc. But this exousia, this shaltan in Aramaic, this authority, is very important because it signals the new era where all the empires have their potestas, or authority or power, or removed, and it's given to one like a Son of Man, who gets all the nations will praise him, and all the tongues, etc. All power, his kingdom is everlasting, etc. That was an incredibly relevant and politically intrusive claim, and Jesus in the Gospel of Mark at least 7 times united to his passion, the Son of Man, the Son of Man. The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He says it in chapter 2, very close to some of the stuff going on in chapter 5 of John, where the Son of Man is the judge. So that, especially for the chief priests, this is hyper messianic language. This is language that is a threat to the Roman Empire. We know that the Sadducees and the chief priests were in cahoots with the Romans. That's the crucifixion of Jesus, is that. The powers that be, religious and political, or political and religious, are the ones that want Jesus dead. I think the Pharisees have a secondary role, if any. They were bitter opponents of Jesus because of the inclusivity of Jesus with these meals, etc., breaking Pharisaic halakha. We were talking about halakha last time, Pharisaic rules of conduct according to the Torah, the oral tradition of the Pharisees, which is part of the oral tradition of the rabbinic Judaism, very much shared with Catholics. Catholics have divine revelation written, that would be the written Torah for Jews, and then they have revelation transmitted by tradition, and this would be the oral Torah for Jews, which eventually is all codified in the Talmud. But you have those two sources of knowledge of the divine will. So that we're going to get into these things regarding the whole shebang, the whole Daniel recapitulation, which ends with resurrection and a judgment, and the Exodus theme, incredibly important. I'm running out of time, so we're going to have to continue with the beginning of Mark next session. We have a lot of things that have to be covered, but I'm reading a book by N.T. Wright, an Anglican bishop in England, The Resurrection of the Son of God. It's a 20-year-old book, and I am delighted to be on the same page with him, if you will. I posted that I had spent almost 50 years preparing to read that book. It's like an 800, 900-page book. And the whole Second Temple Judaism idea of a final exodus, of a final liberation, of a final forgiveness, the new covenant, new creation, all that stuff, which is already in embryonic or even a highly developed form in Second Isaiah. It's very vibrant and vital in the time of Jesus, and that's how we explain what his message is about. And to finish, we're going to see from the very first verses of Mark that you have on the screen, if you can read that. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face who will prepare your way." That's a curveball. That's not Isaiah. What is it? Is it Malachi 3? Or is Malachi 3 recycling Exodus 23? "Behold, I send my angel before you to prepare your way to the place," which is the temple, Makom in Hebrew, is the temple. Solomon in 1 Kings 8 talks about this place. And so he throws us a curveball without citing ambiguously whether it would be Malachi or Exodus. It doesn't matter, it's both. And then he cites Isaiah 40, incredibly important, the new Exodus. "A voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths." And that is a key text associated with John the Baptist, and also a key foundational text for the Dead Sea Scrolls community. So that with that, I'm going to stop just under 15 minutes, and hopefully the next session will continue along these same lines to explore, as scuba divers, if you will, the Gospel of Mark. Thank you.